Okay, you should be seeing my shade-grown coffee plantation now.
Yes, got it.
Okay, all right. Well, my apologies. And okay. So this sort of looks like a jungle, but it's actually coffee under a canopy of trees and large shrubs. So the coffee consumption began pretty much like you're seeing it right now, or at least coffee growing began in the forested highlands of the African country of Ethiopia, and it grew wild there. This was a naturally occurring shrub, and uh, somewhere back in the mists of time, humans discovered that the flavor and mental boost provided by the cherries on these large shrubs were something that they found pleasant, tasted good, and maybe they saw animals eating it and decided to try it themselves. But somewhere long, long ago, um, humans discovered coffee growing wild. And this slide, as I mentioned, depicts pretty much how it might have looked many, many hundreds of years ago. And as humans started um, to migrate to different places and trade commodities with uh, different tribes and different groups of people, of course, the consumption of coffee started to spread from the Ethiopian um, mountains where this coffee was first discovered. History tells us that coffee consumption and cultivation moved out of this East African country across the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula around the 15th century. So that would have been 1600s. And by the 17th century, it had become a popular drink in Europe. And of course, being a popular drink in Europe, it started finding its way to the New World with the European explorers and settlers. And now coffee has grown around the world in the tropical belt. So here's a map of the tropical belt. The tropical belt is bordered to the north by that fine blue line there that's actually the Tropic of Cancer, and goes south through the equator, which is the middle line, and the tropical belt ends with the lowest blue line, which is the Tropic of Capricorn. So everything between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, those latitudinal lines, everything there is quote unquote the tropics. So we have a few colored regions here that I'll quickly talk about. And the orange colored ones are considered to be biodiversity hotspots. And um, I would like you to keep the concept of biodiversity in your mind as we go along here, because I'm going to keep coming back and touching on that concept. So kind of plant that in the back of your mind as we go through. And you'll notice the yellow regions are coffee growing regions, and the blue ones are cacao growing regions, where the fruits where we get cocoa from. And those two agricultural endeavors, you will note, tend to be very closely associated with the biodiversity hotspots. So very quickly, let me change my pointer to a laser pointer. Can you see a laser pointer on the screen now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the four largest coffee growing, or the four countries that have the largest exports of coffee are Brazil, right here. Brazil actually is a huge country. They produce 40% of the coffee that is consumed in the world in Brazil. Vietnam over here in the far east is right here. This coffee growing region right here is in Vietnam, which actually occupies a great deal of this peninsula. Vietnam is sort of a long, curvy country, and they actually produce 16% of the world's coffee in this little country of Vietnam. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. That was a mistake. Do you see my osprey now?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. I somehow knocked us off of sharing. So my apologies. So give me just a second here. All right. Let me know when you see my my map again, please.
It's
I
back
see.
on.
Okay. As I was saying, I'm sorry. So Vietnam produces about 16% of the world's coffee, and Colombia, I'm going to go back to my laser pointer. Colombia, which is in the northern part of the South American continent, produces about 8%. And you can see there's quite a large coffee producing region in Colombia. And where it all began over here in Ethiopia, over in the far eastern part of Africa, I'm circling with this pointer, that's Ethiopia and the mountainous region where they produce 5% of the world's coffee. Now, you can see there's a lot of other coffee producing regions, especially over here in Central America. A lot of coffee is produced there, but most of their coffee tends to stay in their countries. So they're not big, while they do grow a lot of coffee, it's not a big export for them. And further south along the Andes, you have Ecuador and Peru that also are huge biodiversity places and host neotropical migrants from North America, and they do produce coffee. So what we should get out of this is lots of overlap between the very critical biodiversity hotspots around the world and agriculture for not only coffee and cocoa, but for other things as well. Okay, so the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center is a scientific organization that has done quite a bit of research on how to better provide habitat for not only native birds, but also migratory birds in these coffee growing regions and still be able to have the growers grow a profitable commodity like coffee. So, and you'll see this graphic or this illustration again, but just very quickly, in full sun, where coffee, 75% of the coffee is grown in the world today, in the full sun monocultures, they only support those types of plantations only support about 61 bird species. Now that sounds like quite a bit, but as you transition back to a more natural forest where, again, coffee was first cultivated and for centuries cultivated that way, as you start to evolve back toward how coffee originally was found and cultivated, you see a lot more bird species are supported until you get back to a bird-friendly certified shade-grown coffee plantation that supports 243 bird species, or 4 times the amount of species that the sun-grown monoculture on the left supports. So as I mentioned, from its African origins, many hundreds of years ago, up until the 1970s, coffee was actually grown under shade, just like it had always been. But for a variety of reasons in the 70s, farmers were encouraged by big coffee companies to start moving their crops out into full sun plantations. And of course, to get the area, to get the croplands for these full sun plantations, forest had to be cut. That provided a significant increase in yields because they found as they discovered more and more coffee varieties, coffee plant varieties that could thrive in the sun, and then selective hybridization of coffee plants to be more tolerant of the sun, they found that increased their yield. So, hey, we move out into the sun, we increase the amount of coffee we can sell. There were some other more minor factors involved with the evolution to get the sun or get the coffee out of the shade, but the big drive was yield. So as I mentioned before, today 75% of all coffee grown worldwide is farmed using active destruction of forest habitat. And this is a problem not only for birds, but going back to biodiversity again, there's no biodiversity out here in sun-grown coffee. There are synthetic fertilizers, pesticides used, chemicals to control various diseases that coffee can get, and it's just not a good habitat for birds, as you can see by how many species are supported. 4 times as many in bird-friendly shade-grown coffee plantations. So let's summarize before we move on to a little bit different part of the subject matter. We've talked so far about history and origins of coffee consumption, how coffee was cultivated both past and present, and we looked at that map of the tropical belt and saw where coffee and cacao is grown relative to the biodiversity hotspots of the world. Here's the part that I think is going to be a review, but it's always good to review very important scientific discoveries. I'm sure you will recall that in 2019, the very shocking report was published, first in the journal Science, about a study of data from that started back in 1970 to essentially the present in 2019. Scientists confirmed that 2.9 billion birds had been lost in that 50-year time span. And these were scientists from the Cornell University Lab of Ornithology, Georgetown University, scientists from the Canadian Environmental Agency, which is the equivalent of our EPA, along with the U.S. Geological Survey. All of these scientific bodies contributed to this study. And essentially what it did was this study verified what ornithologists had been observing for years. It just brought it all together with very hard data of what the problem was and even more importantly, what the extent and the breadth of the problem was. And that was a shocking percentage of how many birds have been lost since 1970. Number one cause, according to that report, is habitat loss. And related to that, the number 2 cause, according to that report, is habitat degradation. So loss is a lot easier to understand than habitat degradation, which is the number 2 cause. But when you think of degradation, think of fragmentation of habitat, alteration by invasive species, invasive plants, and degradation of water quality. Those are factors when we talk about habitat degradation. So before I leave this half of the slide, I would like to help us all conceptualize numbers that we read in the papers and hear on podcasts and radio every day. We hear millions, especially when it comes to the U.S. government and how much money they spend or how much money we owe, etc., is the number million and the number billion. And it's hard, I think, sometimes for us to really conceptualize the difference between those numbers. A million sounds like a lot. I'd like to have $1 million, but in a billion just kind of runs together with million. But let me give you a couple of examples. In 11 and a half days, 1 million seconds elapse. So 11 and a half days from now, 1 million seconds will have elapsed. For us to have elapsed 1 billion seconds, that takes 31 and a half years. There's a conceptualization that kind of boggles my mind. The difference between million and billion. 1 million seconds goes into 11 and a half days. A billion seconds goes into 31 and a half years. One more example like that. If I gave you $5,000 per day, it would take 6.5 months for you to accumulate $1 million. $5,000 per day for 6.5 months, you'd have $1 million. If I wanted to give you $5,000 a day, and to give you in that amount of money in $1 billion, it would take 547 years at $5,000 today for you to accumulate $1 billion. So getting back to the number 2.9 billion birds lost, that is just a stunning, jaw-dropping amount of birds. Okay, so let's look at that number in a little bit different perspective. It turns out, because there were 529 bird species that were part of that 3 million bird report, 3 million birds lost report. Out of that 2.9 billion, 2.5 billion of those birds were migratory birds. So, and I think it was either 9 or 11 families of migratory birds, but migratory birds have taken the huge brunt of that loss when you put it in that term right there. That accounts for about 28% of migratory bird species that were lost in that 50-year time period. It's just a stunning, when you start to think of the numbers and the percentages. 2 in 5 Baltimore Orioles were lost since 1970. That's a huge percentage of that particular species. So when we think of migratory birds, think songbirds, warblers, thrushes, tanagers, vireos. To a lesser degree, shorebirds, sandpipers, plovers, terns. There were some raptors involved in there. A few waterfowl fall into that migratory bird number, but the songbirds, I think we can all agree, the warblers, thrushes, tanagers, vireos, etc., those took a huge hit. Okay. I wanted to feature just a couple of birds that you all in Florida there likely encounter during spring migration. And I chose the blackpoll warbler, which, as you can see on this range map here, winter in the northern part of South America. And that big blue blob right there for the winter range encompasses several different countries, one of which is Colombia, northern part of Brazil, and Venezuela, excuse me, and Venezuela are all in that winter range there. But as you can see, the migration range passes up through Florida, and then the blackpolls breed in Canada, the Canadian provinces, and quite a bit north of the boundary even. So they are quite a distance migrator for their breeding purposes. I want to show you an animation, but you know what? This, even though I practiced this, I did not notice that the animation, oh, wait a minute, I can just do this. Okay. the animation that I got, do you see the animation, migration animation going on?
Yes.
Okay, good, good. So this is off the National Audubon website, and it is this migration activity, this dynamic migration activity, is actually a conglomerate of different data sources. So do you see the little red dots that are down here in South America right now? And as time scale goes, the red dots start to migrate up into North America. Is everyone seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Those are actually tagged birds. And that data comes from um, various organizations that capture and tag birds so that they can be monitored during migration. And um, the yellow dots that you see up here in New England, those are also tagged birds from a different tagging system. But a lot of this comes from the MODIS system. And I won't go any further into that in case you haven't heard it, but MODIS, MODIS, MOTUS.org will give you their website, and this is information that they share with everyone. But the benefit of what I'm showing you right now is not only is this MODIS information with the tagged birds, but it is also eBird information. And I'm going to let this start over again because it kind of happens fast, but I can stop it and then drag it with my mouse, and you see it go a lot slower, so you can tell what's going on. And you see the dots up there in Florida. There's small, medium, and large dots there in Florida. Does everyone see that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so that is eBird data from people like us that make our eBird checklists. So that is a separate layer of data that this map is showing us. And so you should see blackpoll warblers come through Florida during migration. And now as I get on the timeline to the fall migration, you see all the dots and all the red, yellow dots of the tagged birds, and then the brown dots from the eBird data layer up in the breeding regions. Now you'll start seeing in fall migration, you'll start to see all of those birds coming back down through the United States, back into the winter range in northern South America. Okay, and now we're at winter again. All right, I'm going to pull that screen back down again, and I'm going to show you more quickly this time one more bird, Swainson's thrush, and we will do in a more abbreviated form. We will do that dynamic animation again, but the Swainson's thrush, a little bit different wintering region, more in the Andes mountain range, more western South American continent. A lot of their migration passes up through Central America and up through the western part of the United States. But I want to show you something interesting about this migration path. So let me pull that screen back up for you. Kind of enlarge this a little bit. And you see this shaded region. You see the shaded region here is sort of like a highway, sort of shows you, well, this is the path that all these birds take. And I'm going to stop this dynamic timeline here. We'll go back up into winter range. and then slowly start with a migration again. Once we get into that migration region, you'll start to see a lot of the eBird data dots appear in Central America, start to disappear in the northern part of South America. And look at all the eBird dots appearing now in North America. Not a lot, and I'm backing up now, but look at how few dots actually pass up through Florida during the spring migration. I understand you do see them then, but it doesn't appear that there's a lot that comes through a lot of the Swainson's thrushes. But look how different the fall migration looks now. We're in the fall migration time period now, approaching October, and look at the concentration of Swainson's thrushes in fall migration that pass down through Florida, go across the Gulf, hop, skip, and jump across Cuba, and wind up back in Central America and the northern part of South America. I found that interesting that they take somewhat different routes for their fall migration. All right, let me see if I can back up. Okay, so here's the Swainson's thrush. We just left that. Let's do another quick summary. We talked about that 2019 Journal Science report and the shocking loss of birds in North America since 1970. We looked at seasonal ranges and migration of a couple of migrators that passed through Florida. And now I would like to start doing a little more focus on the Smithsonian organization. But first, again, I want to plant that seed of biodiversity. And of course, we've got a wonderful utopic biodiverse environment here on the right of this illustration. And on the left of this illustration, not so much. We have agriculture, we have human civilization, livestock, jets, helicopters, just not an area that's really all that supportive of biodiversity compared to the right side of this screen here. An early National Zoo board member and tropical conservation biologist who was instrumental in the Smithsonian during his professional years had a quote that the Smithsonian people really like to pass along. And Thomas Lovejoy is quoted as saying, if you take care of the birds, you take care of most of the big environmental problems in the world. And if you think about that, it's a pretty cool way to look at the problems, because some people, less informed people, would say, "Oh, why is everybody so worried about birds? You know, we've got bears and elk and whales and all these other things. What's the big deal with the birds?" Well, birds make up a huge part of the biodiversity, and as Mr. Lovejoy, a conservation biologist, was quoted as saying, you know, if you take care of the birds, pretty much everything else is taken care of as well. So I wanted to share that bit of wisdom with you. And now let's go along and talk about the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, because I mentioned that they are one big organization that is very focused on conservation of a lot of different organisms, birds being one of them. So the Smithsonian Institution itself, I know my slide says a Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, but the Smithsonian Institution itself was founded in 1846. It is the world's largest museum and research organization. It runs 19 museums and galleries. It also runs the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., as well as runs and supports 11 international research centers. And the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center is one of those 11 international research centers. The Migratory Bird Center was founded in 1991, and it is home to the Bird Friendly Coffee Certification Program. And that's where we're headed right now. So, coffee farms with dense and diverse shade trees were found in the early 80s by ornithologists just doing surveys in, turns out to be in northern Mexico, just doing surveys of migratory birds. There was still a lot of shade-grown coffee in that part of Mexico, but the scientists said, you know what, some of the best places that we're finding neotropical migrants is in these shade coffee farms. And that was sort of the aha moment back in the late 80s of ornithologists saying, you know, this is an important concept that we need to kind of pull the string on and find out more about why these birds are drawn to these places and not to other places. And this was sort of the inception of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. And then, of course, it's the evolving of the bird-friendly coffee program. So what is the bird-friendly coffee program? Well, from a high altitude look, it is the gold standard in biodiversity-friendly coffee. It was created by Smithsonian ornithologists. It's 100% shade-grown coffee. It's 100% certified organic and 100% product purity. And the reason that they can say that is they actually certify those three parts, the growing part and, well, two parts, I'll say, the growing part of coffee and the purity part of coffee, because this program certifies not only the farm where it's grown, but it also certifies the importers that move this coffee around in large quantities, and it certifies the people who roast and retail this coffee. Everybody has a little price to pay for this certification. The farmers pay to have their land certified, inspected, and certified for a 3-year certification period. And the people who roast and sell the Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, they pay a royalty of 10 cents per pound. Doesn't sound like all that much to me, but that money that's paid by the farmer and the roaster and retailer, that supports further research in the administration of this certification program. So there are 3 parts that are mandatory parts of this certification, and they are, over on your left, you'll see that organic farming methods are a mandatory part of this certification. As a matter of fact, oh, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the farm has to be organic, certified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, by the way. The farm has to comply with habitat requirements, and that's part of paid third-party inspectors that come in and verify that the habitat meets the certification, and I'll get into that in a little more in detail. And finally, the third mandatory part of the certification involves deforestation, or no deforestation, I should say. There are some recommended criteria, and I'll get to those here in just a few minutes, but a prerequisite, if I'm a farmer that wants to have my shade coffee farm certified by Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, my plantation actually has to already be certified by the USDA as being organic. So that's a prerequisite, and it's a mandatory requirement. So in its simplest form, no artificial pesticides or fertilizers. There are several criteria for the actual land itself, the habitat: 40% shade cover and canopy height of 12 plus meters. So you might say, well, why 40%? Why can't it be 50%? Why can't it be 60? Why can't it be 30%? Well, there's a very good reason for that, based on field studies that have been conducted for decades. the 40% shade cover is sort of a sweet spot. Field researchers have found that native forest birds will use that habitat just like they would an untouched forest. The 40% shade cover is optimal for migratory birds. So the neotropical migrants that winter in these shade coffee plantations will actually use the plantation with 40% shade cover. And coffee will still grow at a productive rate in 40% shade cover. So if you have too much shade, coffee will not grow at a productive rate. If you have less than 40% shade cover, then you start to lose use by not only native but migratory birds. Not only do you have to have the right shade cover, the amount of shade cover, and the organic certification from the USDA, but other mandatory criteria involve tree diversity. And according to Smithsonian certification, there have to be at least 11 species of trees on the farm. And that doesn't mean that 1/4 of the farm can have 11 species, and then the rest, the other 3/4 not have it. These trees, this diversity of trees has to be spread throughout the plantation. And 60% of vegetation must be native. So biodiversity again. Different trees have different fruits, have different insects, host different insects, and those insects are what not only the native birds and other critters want, but it's those insects that the wintering migrants want as well. So biodiverse trees and vegetation, and that attracts the biodiversity of the insects that provide the food for the other animals. The third mandatory criteria is zero deforestation for a minimum of 10 years. So if you just started your coffee plantation 5 years ago, and you're not going to be able to meet a lot of this criteria, but if you're getting close to meeting some of the other canopy and vegetation criteria, if there's still evidence of deforestation within less than 10 years, you fail that part of the mandatory certification. Some more recommended types of habitat is structural diversity. And when I say structural diversity, think in this picture over here. Look at the different canopy levels. Look at the different canopy levels here next to the man. There looks like a sort of a palm tree type of thing, and some shrubs. This might be the coffee plants in this illustration. There are fruit trees here that provide another canopy, and several more canopy layers as you go up. So diversity of structure, places for all different kinds of bugs and birds and other critters to live. Biodiversity. Stumps and dry branches. These provide nesting and roosting places. Epiphytes, growing on all of these canopy structures. Epiphytes being, for example, ferns, orchids, bromeliads that grow on the branches of other trees. Again, creating a biodiverse habitat, not to mention ground cover, which helps stabilize the soil and provides hiding places for insects and other critters that birds and other animals will feed on as well. So, biodiverse habitat. The bird-friendly program, by the numbers, as of 2024, involved 13,800 hectares protected by this program. So 13,800 hectares under agroforestry cultivation that meet the bird-friendly standard that we've just been talking about. And these farms, and by the way, hectare is, I think that's a metric area, a metric unit of area. A hectare is roughly 2.5 acres. So if we multiply 13,800 by 2.5, that gives us somewhere around somewhere around 30,000 acres. And a lot of these are small producers. Look at how many producers make up that 30,000 or so acres of bird-friendly program habitat. In 2024, 31.7 million pounds of bird-friendly coffee were produced from these certified farms that provide habitat for native and migratory birds. 80 licensed bird-friendly roasters and 12 countries are enrolled in this bird-friendly program so far. This is all good news here, but I'm going to give you a little bad news here in just a little while. So keep that 31.7 million pounds of bird-friendly coffee in your mind as we move along. Now, as consumers, we are provided with lots of information about the products that we use. And I want to give you a comparison of some logos and some claims of certification or credentials, if you will, that you will encounter on packages from coffee to cocoa to other kinds of products that may be grown in other countries and may be grown in the tropical belt. Probably everyone has seen that Rainforest Alliance logo. You see that on a number of different products. In that the left-hand column, we also see a fair trade logo, a USDA or Canada equivalent for organic certification, and then the infamous shade grown. You'll see shade grown on a lot of different coffees and other products as well, other commodities, fruits, vegetables, those types of things that we want to see grown in under shade and under good habitat for the birds and the bees. But let's make a comparison of these, and I'll draw your attention up to the bird-friendly logo and certification provided by Smithsonian. Shade coverage, pesticide regulation, and biodiversity protection are the criteria that we're going to compare with the logos and claims of some of these labels that we'll see on products that we're considering purchasing. We just finished looking at the bird-friendly certification program, and I think you might agree that shade coverage is strictly regulated. How much shade, how many native species, canopy layers, height of highest canopy, all those criteria that I just read off to you are part of the bird-friendly certification. Pesticide regulation, 0 synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, and you'll find if you look right down here at the organic row, well, it's the same thing as USDA or the Canadian equivalent organic label, because remember, to get the bird-friendly certification, it was mandatory to already be certified organic. So those two criteria for pesticide regulation are the same. And all farms on Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee, excuse me, all farms provide habitat for diverse community of wildlife because of the strictly regulated shade and native plant coverage. Very common, as I mentioned before, the Rainforest Alliance commonly see that certification on packages. Shade coverage is very loosely certified or regulated by the Rainforest Alliance. You won't see the criteria that I just gave you for bird-friendly coffee. They do allow limited pesticides under the Rainforest Alliance certification. Excuse me, sorry. And some of their farms provide some habitat for birds and wildlife, but if you're not strictly regulating the shade coverage or the pesticide use, how good could the habitat really be if we're comparing it to Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee? Now, a number of different products have a fair trade tag on it, and this is a good thing. Fair trade means There are regulations in place to make sure that workers and farmers and landowners get paid fair prices for whatever crop they're growing. And it just so happens that coffee and cocoa are ones that are commonly fair trade certified. But fair trade has nothing to do with habitat. So shade coverage, not regulated. Pesticide regulation is optional. It's not something that's regulated. And of course, since that doesn't have anything to do with habitat, it only has to do with workers and treating workers fairly. There's no regulations for biodiversity. We've already talked about USDA organic or the Canadian equivalent, but again, they don't really regulate shade coverage. Their focus is synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and agricultural chemicals. That's their thing. So yeah, biodiversity is protected, but if you're on a shade-grown organic coffee farm, there's no biodiversity to protect. Last and least probably is the term shade-grown. I challenge you to find any regulation or definition for shade-grown, this label here. Pesticides are not regulated, and some farms, kind of like the Rainforest Alliance, some farms might provide some habitat for wildlife, but if you're not regulating coverage and you're not regulating pesticides, how much good habitat could you possibly have? I like to think of this shade-grown label being an unregulated claim. It's kind of like if the tavern that you drive by says in the window they have a neon sign that says coldest beer in town. Well, okay, they can make that claim, but how can they prove that? How can you really know that they have the coldest beer in town? It's not a regulated logo or not a regulated claim. Something else a little more closer to food. Farm fresh or free range chicken. These are claims that are not regulated and therefore can't be enforced and essentially don't mean anything to us if we're up on our terminology and what's regulated and what's not. So for all these reasons, Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee, as I mentioned, gold standard for products like bird-friendly coffee and bird-friendly chocolate. We've seen this before. Just as a quick review, 61 species supported in sun-grown coffee. Sounds like a lot, but when you think about it, it's not much at all when you compare to the habitat that you find with bird-friendly certified shade-grown coffee. This photo collage is mostly warblers, but I'm told that there are a few vireos in here. These are all, and I think there are 37 birds on this collage, and these are all birds that, and not all of the birds, but this is a sample of birds found in shade-grown coffee plantations in Central and South America. It's quite a group of birds. So with this certification, we're not only protecting wildlife and people who don't have to work with the synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and other chemicals in this type of agriculture, but we're also protecting the habitat for amphibians and small mammals, including birds. It protects this shade cover, this canopy cover, protects crops from climate extremes like very hard rainfall, windstorms, etc. Because you've got the leaf litter and the wildlife in this habitat, this bird-friendly habitat, it increases soil fertility and holds moisture because of the ground cover. And also because of all the plants, the native plants, the trees, etc., there's carbon sequestration that goes on that helps us control climate change. Not to mention when these farmers have a certified farm, they do earn more money for their products. And it's not just the farmers that are working on these farms, because the birds are out there working too. Pollination, seed dispersal, insect and rodent control is all going on when you have all these birds and other animals that are in these shade-grown Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee plantations. So we got a gap though. I'm sorry to say. Remember a little while ago, when we were talking about the numbers for 2024, and I mentioned about 31 million pounds of coffee were produced in those 4,100 or so different certified farms in Central and South America. Well, 31 million pounds produced, that's a lot of coffee, and it's a good thing. But the gap and the kind of the bad news of this is only 2 million pounds were sold with the bird-friendly label on them. So there's a huge gap in consumer demand. So those farmers still grew that 29 million pounds of coffee, and they still sold that 29 million pounds of coffee, but it wasn't sold with a bird-friendly label, so they didn't get the price that they could get for the extra effort that they have to use and the extra labor to hand pick and to fertilize naturally and to prune back the forest from overwhelming their coffee plants. So there's the gap. One big thing that you and I can do to help continue to grow bird-friendly coffee under the Smithsonian criteria. Because if these farmers, after a couple of years, can only sell a fraction of their coffee at a fair price for their organic and bird-friendly certifications, they might start to be looking at different products, different crops, and maybe clear some of their land to make room for something that they can make more money from. So the demand has a lot of catch up to do from the amount of this coffee that's being produced by the Smithsonian certified farmers. And the Smithsonian has done analysis on this, and it's pretty much just, well, how can we sell more bird-friendly coffee under that label so that we can preserve this habitat? They feel it all comes down to low consumer awareness. We just don't know. The general public just doesn't know about bird-friendly coffee and what it does for native wildlife and what it does for neotropical migratory birds that winter in these coffee growing regions. And of course, with the labels, there is some confusion. Well, this coffee says it's shade grown. It must be good for birds. Oh, it's fair trade. Well, that's a good thing. Oh, and Rainforest Alliance, this has got frog stamps all over it. Well, as we talked a little while ago, not nearly the stringent certification from those other certifying organizations as the Smithsonian program. There is a little issue with product availability as well, but people like me, people like you, now that you know about this, can increase the outreach and help with marketing. And I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions here in just a minute. Here's one right here. This is a QR code. You can put your smartphone camera on that and touch the button, and that QR code will take you to the Smithsonian's bird-friendly coffee website, and you can find out all kinds of stuff about bird-friendly coffee. You can look at pictures of birds that inhabit these bird-friendly farms. You can find out all the different places where you can either buy it locally or online. You can find out other information about research that goes on. lots and lots of information on this website, and that QR code will take you to it. By the way, there are over 80 roasters that you can find on this website. Find their bird-friendly certified coffee and go to their website and buy it and try it for yourself. You might find a local coffee shop that sells bird-friendly coffee, but it may be a lot more difficult, depending on where you live, to find that. But you know, if you do have a favorite local coffee shop and they don't happen to carry bird-friendly coffee, well, Smithsonian's got you covered there too, because they have this little card here that I'll show you how to get this little card, and you can take that card into your favorite coffee shop and say, you know what, I would like to buy bird-friendly coffee from you. And here's how you find bird-friendly coffee. So you hand this little card to your favorite barista, and they can scan this QR code with their phone, and they can find out, as a coffee shop or a coffee roaster that doesn't carry bird-friendly coffee, they can find out how they can carry bird-friendly coffee so you can buy it from them right in their store. And if you take a shot of this QR code, it will take you to a place where you can print off those little cards that I just showed you. And it comes in a little page of 4, and you can make 2 cuts through that and have 4 of those little cards to hand out to your coffee shop. And if you only take one piece of information from these different sources that I've given you thus far, this would be the one, because this email address will take you to an outreach member of the Smithsonian Bird Friendly Coffee Organization, and they will answer any question you want about bird friendly coffee, where to find it, how to use the website, what other pamphlets or information that they would be willing to send you. This will be a person. It's not a website, it's their email address. This will be a person that corresponds with you and will tell you anything you want to know. As we get really close to the end, I hope, in conclusion here, I hope everyone has learned something today. This has been a real pleasure for me to talk to you about something that I'm very passionate about. And that is the end, and I just hope that you have some questions for me. And I will unshare my screen, and we'll go back to looking at each other.
Thank you very much. It's really
Yeah.
interesting.
So we do have a few questions.
Good.
Sherry Ann wants to know, is the coffee grown in the shade the same species grown in the full sun, or a different variety?
That's a good question. There are actually 2 main varieties of coffee in the world. One is Arabica and one is Robusta. And in the United States and Canada, we tend to drink much more Arabica beans. Other parts of the world, they like the Robusta, and there's some significant differences between the 2, caffeine levels and flavors, etc. But if you break it down further, for Arabica, for instance, as I mentioned, since the 70s, when the big coffee producers started encouraging the farmers to get their coffee crops out of the shade and more into the sun, they tinkered around with hybridization of coffee plants and were able to produce varieties of coffee plants that did better in that full sun. So I've probably told you everything about that subject that I know, but I think the shorter answer is there are a number of different sub-varieties of the Arabica and the Robusta coffees.
And Deborah wanted to know, are there any popular brands that have bird-friendly coffee, like Pete's? Any major brands?
Pete's doesn't come to mind, but I would be stunned if you went into um, oh gee, now I can't now I oh Publix. I was trying to think of a Florida grocery store chain. I would be stunned if you walked into Publix and they had a brand of bird-friendly, Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee on the shelves.
Yeah.
Do you have in Florida Whole Foods?
Yes.
Yeah.
They do sell a store brand that's called Allegra. They do sell a Smithsonian bird certified bird friendly variety of their own store brand coffee.
Oh,
Oh, which brings me to another thought that I forgot to mention earlier, but this is very important. When you go to that website, the bird friendly website, and they'll have buttons for how can I learn more about bird friendly coffee? Where can I buy bird friendly coffee? When you follow that where can I buy bird friendly coffee path, it will show you just scads of different roasters and sources of bird friendly coffee. Many of those roasters not only sell Smithsonian certified bird friendly coffee, but they also sell just regular coffee that may be from Central or South America, but doesn't have the bird friendly certification. So you got to look for that bird friendly Smithsonian logo that showed throughout on these slides. One company that pops to mind and I've bought their coffee before, it's called Birds and Beans. They only sell bird friendly coffee. And Kathy's shaking her head. Are you familiar with that brand?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So they're a safe bet. Anything that they offer to sell you is certified bird friendly. Many of the others sell bird friendly, but they also sell non-bird friendly coffee. So you got to look for that logo when you're buying online or even buying in person.
that's a good tip. All right.
I
Any other
had a
questions?
question.
Oh,
So is Smithsonian, do you know, are they going to do anything with like bird-friendly chocolate?
That's a good question. I've sort of mentioned that a couple of times. They've had a bird-friendly chocolate certified program since, see, this is 25. I'm going to say it was since January or early 2023. It's still sort of getting off the ground, but I'll give you a little bit of history on that. All of their certified farms are in the Dominican Republic, which is in the Caribbean, and it shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti. Okay, so there are 17. It's a cooperative of 17 farms, and they are Smithsonian bird friendly certified. And there are 3 certified chocolate makers that buy that cocoa and make Smithsonian certified bird friendly chocolate. So it's sort of in its infancy right now. But if you go to the bird friendly website that I gave you the QR code for, you can find your way to those 3 producers of Smithsonian bird friendly coffee. And the really cool thing about, and maybe it's why they picked the Dominican Republic, I don't know, but that 17 farm cooperative is called Zorzal, and Zorzal is Spanish for thrush. And if you've ever heard of a Bicknell's thrush, that bird breeds in the maritime provinces of Canada and also in northern Maine. Okay, those Bicknell thrushes winter on the island of Hispaniola. That's pretty much the only place they winter.
Wow.
And so it's just kind of a cool fact that that's where right now where the bird friendly chocolate is coming from.
Is it similar to the coffee in that it's shade grown?
That's a good question, Deborah. I honestly don't know the answer, and I don't know what the criteria is, like the canopy levels, the native plant requirements, the shade amounts. I don't know the answer to that.
Very interesting.
These
Yeah.
are all excellent questions. Keep them coming.
Any other questions?
Well, Sharon Chester says, I think cocoa requires shade. And Sharon, I think you're right. I don't know a lot about it, but I know when I was in Ecuador several years ago, in a really far and removed place, this was a birding tour. We walked through an area where a forested area where there were coffee plants pointed out to us and cocoa growing. So it's just from that minimal amount of experience, I can say that, yeah, I've seen those two growing together under forest canopy. So Sharon, I think you're right about that.
Interesting.
All right. We'll probably have questions later, but at the moment, that's all we got.
Okay. Well, you know my email address. Don't hesitate.
Okay.
Much.
I'll put it on the video, on the YouTube for everybody again. And well, thank you so much for taking your time.
Yes.
Sure.
Very
It's
interesting.
a pleasure.
Yes.
Night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you for having me, and good night to all of you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.